Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. All right, we're not advancing here. All right, so as a DoD employee, we have this wonderful thing we have to share with you called our disclaimer. So the opinions that I'm going to express today are the opinions of Troy Morgan and not that of the Army or any agency of the federal government. All right, so we got that behind us. The history of our talk today, and thank you for inviting me out to talk about the history of the United States Army, is something I'm extremely passionate about, something I've been involved with for almost 4 decades now, and specifically talking about the history of U.S. Army forestry engineers. However, as I was reviewing this in the last couple of days, I thought, wow, I think that word operations may mean something different to us military people than it does to the audience to which I'm speaking. So let's define operations in this context, just so we make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So for the purpose of my presentation, I want operations to mean the use of wood to obtain the aims of warfare. The use of wood to obtain the aims of warfare, okay? As Jim said, my name is Troy Morgan. I am a military historian, and historians and young children have at least one thing in common, and that one thing is why? Okay, I am blessed with a 4-year-old grandson, Arlo. That's Arlo right there. And no matter what my wife and I say to Arlo, he almost always has the same response. And as I was preparing my talk for you guys today, I really dug hard to try to answer the why. It's easy for us as historians to answer the what, but the why is elusive. So I've given you every why that I can, and just as with Arlo, there'll be a couple missing from this one, okay? So a good place to start is in the beginning. So at the birth of the United States Army, we really didn't have much need for sawmills. Okay, the Army is very, very small. When we used wood products, we used them in their raw form. This is a bridge from the Civil War. Very, very common. And even in our forts, in the palisades that surrounded our forts, and even the buildings on our forts, tended to use raw lumber whenever we could. When we were in areas where lumber was not plentiful, say the American Southwest, we would use alternate construction methods. Like if you look at a lot of the old forts down there, they're made out of adobe, right? When we did need dimensional lumber, we would generally purchase it. The earliest instance I've been able to find of the United States Army soldiers operating a sawmill was actually in 1921 at nearby Fort Snelling, when the soldiers set up a sawmill on the Anthony Falls. Okay. During the Civil War, we start off with just one company of engineers, right? And then in April, right at the start of the war, we're going to grow to 4 companies of engineers in the active force. The vast majority of the engineer units that are going to serve in the American Civil War are from the state forces, okay? New York is going to provide 4 full regiments. Michigan provides 1 regiment. And then there's several smaller, battalions and companies and detachments. This is an interesting document I was able to find in the archives at Fort Leonard Wood, and it's actually a contract between the Army and this guy named Mr. S.A. Ballinger, who owned a sawmill in Waverly, Illinois. It's really hard to read up there on the screen, but the Army has contracted with Mr. Ballinger to take over operations of his sawmill for 77 days at a cost of $1 a day, okay? But that was really kind of the exception. More often what we would do is we would use lumber in its native form, as we've done for the previous 85 years. This is a church that was built in the compound of the 50th New York engineers near Petersburg, Virginia. And let me zoom in here. I got a closer picture. You can see they've almost exclusively used logs in their native form, right? And even smaller sticks into the decorations on it. But even in this photo there, I don't think you see any dimensional lumber. And this is pretty much what we did during the American Civil War. And again, if we needed dimensional lumber for something, it tended to be purchased locally. All right, so let's move on to the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War is really the emergence of America as kind of a global power. I was not able to document any use of U.S. Army soldiers operating sawmills during the Spanish-American War. And I suspect it wasn't so just because of the logistics nightmare that the war was and also how short it was. But immediately following the Spanish-American War, we get into that period of our history known as the Philippine Insurrection. Again, I wasn't able to find any sources of soldiers operating sawmills, but we do know that the United States Army had 2 companies of engineers in the Philippines, so it is possible, although not documented. I was able to document lots of instances of the Army purchasing either dimensional lumber or in most cases purchasing firewood from local vendors. That was quite common. Even though the Spanish-American War and the Philippine Insurrection really don't highlight the use of soldier foresters in any way, it really kind of sets the stage for these Army bringing on active duty loggers and lumbermen. But before we get into that, let's look at what happens, because this short period between the Spanish-American War and World War I is a huge transformational period in the Army. And a lot of that transformation has to deal with why and how that we're going to start using soldier foresters. So you have the Spanish-American War, very, very short period of time there. The next event is the creation of the Army War College. So 1901, and this comes about really because the Spanish-American War is a logistics nightmare. America and the Army and the Navy really weren't prepared for warfare of that size and that scope. And you saw on the previous map, we're basically fighting all over the world at that point. So General Order 155 is issued in 1901, and it does 2 things. It creates the Army General Staff, which is really kind of a much more professional and unity of command type organization, and it really prepares the Army for the successes that we're going to see in our future conflicts. And it allows us to better plan and better prepare for warfare and really make our forces much bigger combat multiplier. The second thing that it does is it creates the Army War College, right, which is today located at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. And the War College is a it's like a graduate school for our senior officers, right? Lieutenant colonels and colonels go there, and they learn to work on senior level staffs and command higher level units. But General Order 155 is interesting in that what it taxes and what it creates the school for. The students would work on military issues of the day that were of interest to the general staff of the Army while studying national defense, military science, and command. The second thing that really has a huge influence on the U.S. Army and our later use of foresters is the Russo-Japanese War. There's a tendency that really kind of predates the Civil War of allied nations and even neutral nations would send observers to conflicts. The U.S. Army sent observers to the Crimean War. We sent observers to the Russo-Japanese War. And really what these observers would do, and all the nations pretty much did it, all of your kind of first world powers, second world powers did this. And really what they were trying to do is just get an assessment of how warfare was evolving. And the lessons that we learned from the Russo-Japanese War is that technology advancements over the previous years were really going to favor the defender, right? And we start seeing massive use of trench warfare in the Russo-Japanese War. Next thing that comes out of this is in 1905, the Army starts studying what the soldiers carry, what we call individual tools. So it's anything carried on the soldier's body, all their gear. And for the first time, the Army is going to issue an entrenching shovel, a entrenching pick, and wire cutters to be carried on the individual soldier. Before this, and these are the smaller ones, you may see them, the shovels are folding shovels, right? And the picks they come apart. These are small pieces. Before this, the Army carried larger digging implements, but they carried them on wagons that followed the soldiers. So they start studying it in 1905. In 1910, we actually field this. And so of a squad of 12 soldiers, you'd have like 6 shovels, 2 picks, and wire cutters. Everybody didn't carry every piece. Some people carried one piece of those implements. But they're really designed to help the soldiers fortify, because we saw that preparing fortifications and foxholes and stuff was going to become very important. And you kind of see where this is leading into World War I, right, with all the trenches and stuff. Okay. In 1916, we have a couple things going on, and this really comes out of the Defense Appropriations Bill of 1915. Remember, back at this point, the fiscal year didn't end at the end of September, it ended at the end of June, okay? At some point, we changed the fiscal year, the U.S. government did. But we've got the punitive expedition going on in Mexico, and we got World War I going on in European theater of operations. So the Army kind of realizes we're probably going there at some point. And so they start expanding the forces. And for the engineers, that expansion is adding of 10 regiments. So we're gonna go from 3 regiments. In 1903, we went from 1 regiment to 3. And at this point, we're gonna add 10 more regiments. But in 1916, these are just kind of added to the books. Congress creates the authorization for them. We haven't started creating the units yet. But it's very interesting what Congress creates. Instead of expanding the regular Army, Congress expands the National Guard and what is later going to become the Army Reserve. And they do it by adding 9 railway regiments and a forestry regiment, what was known as the 10th Engineers at that point. Okay. World War I is really kind of the seminal changing period of the U.S. Army engineers. And I like to kind of characterize that change as this, from generalist to specialist. So prior to this, everybody did all missions within the Army Corps of Engineers. And our missions were pretty simple. You know, it was bridging, breaching, road maintenance, that kind of stuff. But what happens is, going back to the previous slide, you know, in the evolution in warfare, things that come out of, you know, everything from the American Civil War up to the Spanish-American War and the Russo-Japanese War, what's happening is warfare is embracing technology more and more. We're going to use, you know, think about the Spanish-American War. We have soldiers walking ashore in heavy woolen uniforms, right? And less than a generation later, we're using airplanes, we're using tanks, we're using machine guns. So warfare has taken a huge a huge leap forward. Because of that, it's impossible now for one engineer unit to perform all of the missions of the Corps of Engineers. And World War I is going to become the point at which we have the most missions. So we start creating these specialty engineer units. Okay? You can see from this poster, this is one of a multitude of posters, recruiting posters, Corps of Engineers in World War I. I'm going to zoom in on that center portion there because I want you to be able to see what the Army is trying to recruit. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to recruit men who already have the skills to use modern technology in warfare. And we see this over and over and over in what we in the Army call the technical services, right? Ordnance, quartermaster, signal corps, the medical corps, and of course, the Corps of Engineers. We want to try to get a guy who already has the skills we need so we can save time. We don't have to train him, right? And of course, time is money, right? Okay, so let's move on to World War I, excuse me. In World War I, the Corps of Engineers is going to have the most missions. We're going to do our typical combat engineer mission that we've always done, which, if you think about engineers, and whenever I talk to civilians, I try to give this really good analogy. We have 2 types of engineers, and this oversimplification is type 1 destroys things, type 2 builds things. Okay? If you just keep frame it in that context, that's us in a bumper sticker. All right? So it's interesting to note that how quickly, remember you saw in the previous poster, we were trying to recruit guys who already have the skills we need. So how quickly we're doing them. So April 1917, war is declared on Germany. August 10th, the 10th Engineer Regiment deploys to France. Okay? What's that, 5 months from the time the war is declared, the unit's activated, and it's arrived in France in 5 months. Just incredibly fast. Okay? The first unit that goes over is the 10th Engineer Regiment. The Army did initially activate 2 forestry regiments, the 10th and the 20th, but they're quickly merged together. So all the literature you hear from War War I is basically of the 20th Engineers, but it is kind of interesting that 2 units formed, they merged together and they moved over. Okay? This photo shows one of the U.S. mills in Brookings, France. This is near Langier. The U.S. operated some French fixed mills. And we also did have, each of the units had organic mobile sawmills that they deployed with. By the time the war by the time the war ended, the 20th Engineers were operating 81 different sawmills, some civilian, some military. They're producing 2 million board feet of lumber a month. Okay. These are some of the mills from the 20th Engineers. 20th Engineers is also going to be the largest regiment ever formed in the United States Army. So a regiment at that time tended to be about 68,000 men. 6,800 men. Today, we would equate that to like a brigade, if you hear the terms brigade in the Army today. And they tend to run from about 4,500 to about 4,500 to 6,000 men. The 20th Engineers had 18,500 men assigned to it, and then had another 10,000 quartermaster troops in. So it's almost larger than the divisions that were formed. Okay, and divisions would have almost 10 regiments to give you some kind of scope there. In January 1919, the 20th Engineers start deploying back because the war's going to end in November, right? November 11th. So in January 1919, 20th Engineers start deploying back to the United States, and by July, the entire 20th is back in the States. During that short time, less than a year from the time the first board was cut until the war ended, 20th Engineers cut 200 million board feet of lumber and pilings and another 300,000 cords of lumber, which represents about 75% of the dimensional lumber used by the AEF and 90% of the firewood used. So when I'm doing my research, and I've been researching this since, oh goodness, probably about my first article on it is 1999, so to give you a perspective. I kept coming across these banners or photos similar to this that were talking about records being produced and how much is produced. And I think down in the bottom left corner, it's got like 64,000 board feet that they produced in 10 hours. Most of these guys are cutting on these portable mills that are designed to cut 10,000 board feet in 10 hours. So right away, I was really kind of confused by, okay, how are you doing? I kept coming across records that were 5, 6, almost 7 times what the mill was designed for. And I know we all tend to manipulate statistics, and that's why I titled this slide this way. But it really bothered me. I started digging into the unit histories and digging into the letters written by the soldiers. And it took me about 5 years to figure out what these guys were doing. Because, this may come as a shock. Soldiers tend to be type A people, and we tend to be very, very competitive. So what I found from going into those primary source documents is that the days when the records were set was when they were producing orders for like piers or bridges. So if you think about the bents on a bridge, they tend to be 12 by 12. So you're getting a lot of board feet really quick when you're cutting 12 by 12 timbers, right? Or your decking tends to be 3 by 12s. So you can see how they're quickly manipulating the statistics to do that. Luckily enough, we have several of these still exist, these banners today. Okay. So one of the most fascinating things when you start talking about the history of U.S. Army Forestry Engineers, and probably least known, is a unit known as the Spruce Production Division. Okay. This is a picture of an aircraft assembly plant in France. So the airplanes of the day were basically made out of wood and canvas, and the canvas was painted with some sort of resin dubbing material in order to make it wind resistant and waterproof. And you really needed good lumber to build these planes, right? It needed to be straight-grained lumber. And the best wood to produce these planes was Sitka spruce. So the problem was there wasn't much of a commercial market for Sitka spruce at that particular time. And by 1916, the European allies were buying all the spruce we could produce, and we started getting a shortage of spruce. So right about this time, about mid-1916, the Army is also starting to look at, we're going to war. We're going to war in the future, so we need to really forecast our needs. What does that mean to the U.S. Army, and therefore to America, because all this stuff has to be forecasted because Congress has to authorize everything, right? So we're trying to produce the estimates to get to Congress, to produce appropriations that allows the Army to spend into World War I. And so we start looking at what do we think our future needs for spruce are going to be. And I come up with 10 million board feet per month, but the commercial market was only capable of producing about 2 million board feet per month. Now, this labor situation, the shortage of lumber was exacerbated by the labor situation in the Pacific Northwest, which had been quite troublesome really since the turn of the century. Many of the loggers had started to unionize under what was called the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, right? Which was probably socialist, which was a socialist-leaning organization, most definitely, but that really wasn't that uncommon at that period in time. Okay, so as the demand for Sticka spruce is going up and lumber products in general, we have this labor unrest in the Northwest, and then the IWW implements a work slowdown in the camps, and it's making it even worse. So in May of 1917, General Pershing appoints this guy, Bruce Disk, and he asked him, just look at what's going on, maintain this. He was a soldier, he'd been in the Army for 18 years, and him and Pershing had served together in the Philippines, but he really kind of had an interest in labor and labor relations and that kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, he had left the Army after 18 years, which some of you are thinking 18 years he was close to retirement, but he really wasn't close to retirement because a 20-year retirement doesn't come about until 1947. So he's only about halfway. It's a 30-year retirement at this point. He's only halfway there. But he makes a decision to leave the Army, and he gets appointed as a warden of a prison up in Michigan. So he's a civilian in May of 1917, and he's appointed to a commission to basically look into labor unrest and spruce supply. The production continues to decline, specifically of spruce, and the IWW is really targeting spruce because they realize the supply-demand situation, right? And they're trying to, as a labor union, leverage what they can to get what their aims for their membership. So, DISC develops a plan, and his plan is basically we're going to use soldiers to supplement this situation and improve the situation in the Pacific Northwest. On 29 September 1917, he returns to active duty with the rank of lieutenant colonel. This picture was probably taken right after that because really quickly he's going to be promoted to colonel in November. And he's appointed to head the spruce production division, and we select Portland, Oregon as the location for that. You may notice, it's hard to see on the picture here, but DISC is wearing Army Aviation collar brass. Now you would think a forestry unit would be under the Army Corps of Engineers, but the way the Army looked at it was not as what they were producing, but what they were producing for aircraft, right? And the Army Air Service at that point fell underneath the Army Signal Corps. So the soldiers who served in the Spruce Production Division wore either aviation insignia or Signal Corps insignia. And that's why he's got the propellers on there. Okay, so the Spruce Production Division had 4 missions. Number 1 was to improve civilian labor situation and increase spruce production. Number 2 was to build railroads to transport the spruce to the mills faster and to get into deeper spruce groves. Number 3 was the actual production of the spruce itself. We're going to use soldier loggers up there. And then number 4, the Spruce Production Division operated a huge sawmill at Vancouver Barracks, Washington, where the trees were milled down into the initial lumber that we're going to send off to the aircraft facilities, the aircraft plants where the planes are going to be made. So let's look at spruce production a little bit deeper. So we have the IWW that's trying to slow things down. We're going to bring in the Spruce Production Division and soldiers. The Spruce Production Division kind of creates this club, for lack of a better term, known as the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen, right? Better known as 4L, okay? This photo shows a typical Pacific Northwest lumber camp after the Spruce Production Division. It's really difficult to see, but it's about 50% soldiers and about 50% civilian loggers, okay? Here's some of the materials by the Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen. They had cards that they handed out to them. The soldiers would have worn 1-inch collar discs that told what branch of service they are. So Spruce Production soldiers would have worn those discs there on the left. The Loyal Legions of Loggers and Lumbermen handed out similar discs for the civilian loggers to wear within the camps, right? And you can notice that the one in the upper left and the one in the lower right are real similar to what the soldiers are wearing, okay? But it takes more than improving the food in the camps and handing out little buttons to really suppress the IWW. That was really kind of the main problem out there. So there's a really great study. It's a guy's PhD dissertation. It's written in 1967. He was out at Berkeley. And he does a deep dives into the IWW. And in his dissertation, he talks about how these agitators, he stumbles across this thing that all these agitators in the camp, the IWW foremans and stuff in these labor camps, they keep getting drafted, right? So I'm like, oh, I'm a historian, I love indicators, right? But indicators are just that, they're indicators, it's just an opinion. So you need to have facts. So we start deep diving in, and I was never able to find a specific case, right? So this is purely the opinion of this doctoral dissertation supported by a lot of research. But there is clearly a trend of the Union leaders in the camps being drafted and finding themselves in France. So I'm careful to say it was not U.S. Army policy, but the historical record is clear to the outcome, if not the process. Right? Okay, so let's look at kind of the characteristics of these forestry operations during the Great War. Number one, highly centralized. Both the 20th Engineer Regiment in France and the Spruce Production Division are going to be highly centralized operations, which is exactly the opposite of what we'll see in World War II. Very, very decentralized. Also, relies heavily on civilian experience. It is amazing how many of these guys come out of the Forest Service and the State Forest Service too. So this is James Woodruff. We've already looked at the Spruce Production Division, so let's go over here and look at the 20th Engineers. James Woodruff, he's a professional soldier, okay? He was in the Army from 1899 to 1941. It's a long time. He retires in July of 41, and then after Pearl Harbor, he's recalled to active duty for 2 more years, almost 2 more years. So this guy was in the Army for a long, long time. He'll end up making Major General, and his father was a retired general. So yeah, he comes from a military family. He's a military guy. But that was about it. This is William Greeley. He was Woodruff's deputy. He's going to go on to become the 3rd Chief Forester of the U.S. Forest Service. And what we do is, it's interesting, if you look at all of the battalions within the 20th Engineer, the senior guy is almost always a regular Army guy. And then there's usually a sprinkling of 1 or 2 other people in there that are regular Army guys. The vast majority of these guys are people with civilian Forest Service experience. Reflect back on that recruiting poster that you saw. We're trying to get people who already have the experience that we need. And this was not unique to the forestry units. We see the same thing in the railway units. You know, the Army would go to a railway company and approach the leadership and say, hey, you know, we need a railway regiment in France. Can you assist us? And they would take a senior guy in that company and make him a colonel, right? Everybody wants to be a colonel. Colonels make lots of money, right? So they would take this civilian and they would make him a colonel, and they'd say, can you bring some of your guys with the technical skills that it takes in order to operate this type of engineer unit that we want? Forestry or railway or whatever the thing was. And they would say yes, and they would bring several hundred of their guys that would fulfill 2 real roles. They're going to become the supervisors and managers within that organization, the technical experts, right? And then some of the operating men. And then we would dump in 400 or 500 draftees, right? And then a couple months later, we're going to give you all guns. We're going to send you to France. That's a recipe for disaster, right? Whole bunch of civilians, no training, guns, going to war. So we got to sprinkle in those regular Army guys, right? Just to kind of keep what we like to call good order and discipline, right? All right, so, and it's amazing, as some of you guys have more forestry experience or forest history experience than I do, you'd probably read through those rosters and be like, yep, you know these guys. So let's fast forward to the interwar years. It's really interesting how quickly, and you kind of got that in the previous speaker, the Army's going to demobilize after conflict, both World War I and World War II. In 1920, we've kind of got through demobilization. We have a small occupation force in Germany still, right? But the Army goes through a transformation. And in this transformation, we're really trying to capture the lessons learned from World War I. And this slide you're probably looking at saying, I have no idea what that means. And I realized that about 3 days ago when I was rehearsing this. So here's what it means. The Army, we took, and instead of having all these different kind of regiments, right? In World War I, we're going to have forestry, railway. We have 6 different types of railway units. We have water supply units. We have road construction units. We have pier construction units. We have searchlight units. We have flashing and ranging units. Flashing and ranging is interesting. These are the guys that create what we call today counter battery. So they have these huge trailers with they look like speakers, but they're listening devices. And we position these little trailers all along the front lines of the battlefield. And when the Germans fire their big guns, these flashing and ranging guys hit their stopwatch. And then when they hear the bang of the gun, they hit their stopwatch again. Using the difference between the speed of sound and the speed of light, they determine how far that gun is away. And when we take those calculations from multiple points on the battlefield, we're able to triangulate, figure out exactly where the gun is, and then we bring our own artillery into it. In addition to that, the Army Chemical Warfare Service and the Army Tank Corps are going to come out of the Corps of Engineers. So we have all these different missions. So in 1920, we're saying we have all these different units. We need to, as we shrink, figure out, incorporate the lessons learned and figure out how to fight the next battle better. So what they do is they come up with what's known as an auxiliary engineer battalion, which basically takes all construction trades, all construction tasks, what we call today the professional trades, and forestry, and puts them into that one unit. Okay? 1929, we changed the name of the unit from auxiliary to engineer battalion separate. Now, where this chart is important is 0 in the regular Army. So there's none in the regular Army. At the time, we had 4 components to the services. The regular Army inactive, there was 32. Except for the regular Army inactive was nothing more than a book. It was a book that said how we were going to expand the Army. There was no people in the regular Army inactive. Okay? National Guard, we had 30 of these. And then we had what was called the ORC. This is my favorite of all the U.S. Army badges ever issued, the Minuteman badge. And this is what the officers and soldiers of the Officers Reserve Corps would wear. There's 108 units. But again, these are not real units. All these 108 and about 2/3 of that 30 are either one of 2 things. It's a skeletonized unit, so it's a unit that in warfare is designed to be, say, 800 men, and we have maybe 12 or 20 guys that are actually drilling 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks out in the summer, okay? Or it's a purely paper unit. But it is important in that we've created the thought process and the organizational structure that is going to allow us to expand for the next conflict. So let's fast forward to the next conflict, the Second World War. Okay, this is a timber trestle bridge across the Rhine River, and if we zoom in real quickly, you can see on the side there that particular bridge consumed 290 board feet of lumber. 290,000 board feet of lumber. One bridge across one river in one theater of operation. World War II is going to consume lumber on a colossal scale. The Army just deployed 9 forestry engineer companies to the European theater of operation. This next series of photos here are all from the 800th Engineer Forestry Company. They're the first forestry unit to deploy during World War II. And they participated in the North African, Italian, and the European campaigns. So they're basically there for the entire war. The Army also deployed 5 forestry companies to the Pacific and 2 to the China, Burma, India theater of operations. This photo here is from the 798th Engineer Forestry Company operating a portable mill in Burma. It's interesting if we read the Chief of Engineers after conflict reports, we call after action reports, from World War I and World War II, they both say the same thing. We didn't have enough forestry engineers. I said there was 9 forestry companies in the European theater of operations. The chief engineer, a guy named General Moore from the European theater of operations, in his final report of the war, he says, we could have had 20 forestry companies and they wouldn't have been able to produce the lumber that we needed. So there's a huge gap in capacity there. So let's look at how and why the Army filled that gap in capacity. Okay, number 1 was substitution. This photo here is of the Army Post Office in Port Moresby, New Guinea. It's a little bit difficult to see there, but you can see they've used corrugated tin, and it looks really, really bad, so it was probably repurposed from somewhere else in the theater. If you look closely at the sidewalls are made out of two things. They're made out of canvas, and they also they repurposed a lot of the shipping boxes in the Pacific Theater of War. Back then, all your boxes are made out of wood, so they make good wood products, right? Good productions. It's much more common to see repurposing of shipping crates in the Pacific Theater than it is in the other theaters of operation. Mainly because, we had the Germany first policy. Our policy was we're going to defeat Hitler, and then we're going to focus our resources. Until we defeat Hitler, the other theaters are secondary theaters of operation. You look at the mass distances in the Pacific Theater of Operation, and the Army has always, and probably will always, we have a hierarchy of support, right? First you need soldiers, because any of the other stuff that comes after them is no good without the guy, right? You need bullets, because we need them to fight. Then we need food, right? And then we need fuel, and you can see how this goes down. And guess what's on the bottom of the list? Lumber, right? Because it's big, it consumes a lot of shipping space, right? And we can generally deal without it. So you see that there in the post office at Port Moresby, the substitution. Another thing falling within substitution was the use of native construction. Okay, so we would use already existing native facilities, and we'd also hire locals to use local construction techniques to build facilities for us. This here is a medic from the 7th Portable Hospital in New Guinea, and you can see in there. I don't think I've zoomed in on this photo. I think there's one piece of dimensional lumber in the entire thing. In the background, you can see there's a few Army issue cots, but they've ran out of Army issue cots, and you look in the foreground and see what you see there is they have locally produced, cots. Within this subcategory of substitution, we also have capturing of enemy stocks, which is, with a lot of our construction materials, this is the main way that we did things up to that point. Okay, so again, let's go back to the European Theater of Operations. The military guys, the Army Foresters, produced 11 million board feet during the conflict, but we captured 24 million board feet of German and Italian lumber, so more than twice. Okay, another kind of interesting alternate production method was the Army issued chainsaws. This is a 24-inch chainsaw, and then they also issued 36-inch chainsaws. Again, research and reports tell you things, and they just create more questions sometimes. So the Army issued over 15,000 of the 36-inch chainsaws. They issued 295 of the 24-inch. It took me a while to figure this one out. The reason they issued so few of the 24 inches, the 24-inch were only issued to the airborne engineer battalions that supported our 5 airborne divisions. Everybody else got the 36-inch, right? And I don't know if it was, I would imagine it's pretty hard to jump out of an airplane with a chainsaw anyways, whether it's 24 or 36, but I'm sure the Army had some logic for that decision. But that's why so few of the 24 inches are issued. The Army also maintained portable sawmills as theater level stock. So the Army ships a lot of extra stuff to the combat zone because we're going to need it, right? Stuff gets destroyed. Believe it or not, soldiers do actually break things occasionally in the Army. For those of you, I see the guys that have Army and military experience because they're all nodding, right? But we maintained these portable sawmills. And when there was a shortage of lumber, they would issue that to a non-forestry unit and have them produce lumber where necessary. This particular photo is taken somewhere in the Pacific Theater of Operation. Unfortunately, it didn't have a caption on it, so I can't tell you where or when it was taken. This next photo I can. This next photo is the 115th Combat Engineer Battalion, and they're operating a portable sawmill on New Britain. You might notice that they've employed some local nationals to assist with the production of lumber, right? Probably as a labor force, much more so than a technical force, I would imagine at that point. We also operated civilian mills. This is actually a law mill in New Caledonia that was, New Caledonia, New Britain, let me see here. In Plum, New Caledonia. It had been abandoned for a decade, and Foxtrot Company of the 131st Engineers came in It was identified through aerial reconnaissance. They thought it was a sawmill. They sent a recon team in and discovered it was definitely a sawmill. And so they sent in some soldiers. Soldiers repaired the mill, got it into operation, and started producing lumber. At the plum mill in New Caledonia, the logs were floated down the river, and then they used this derrick to pull them up onto this kind of makeshift little train, I guess you could call it there, for a short trip down to the mill itself. The Army also contracted for civilian mills to produce lumber. If we go back to the European Theater of Operations, in November of 1944, Justin Patton's Third Army, one of the 5 armies that's going to be 5 U.S. armies that are fighting in the European Theater of Operation. In November, Third Army had contracted with 21 mills, civilian mills, to produce lumber, and they produced 324,000 board feet. At the same time, the 1391st U.S. Army Engineer Forestry Company, right, an active duty unit, using just 2 mills, their 2 organic mills, produced 382,000 board feet. So you can see, so a lot of these things are real small mom and pop mills that we're contracting with. This here is a Belgian mill where the Army has contracted with a civilian company to operate the mill, but I think this photo is very interesting because you notice there's a civilian and a soldier there. So soldiers were provided to augment whenever a labor force was short. It wasn't common, but it did happen. This is a mill in southern Germany where the 7th Army Engineers took over the mill. Again, the civilians, the southern part of Germany was much more hostile. Bavaria area was much more hostile than other areas. In this particular mill, the employees had refused to report to work. So the Army just took over the mill and started cutting in their mill. The last way that we're going to make up for the shortage of U.S. Army Forestry Engineers is what we call production support. So this is a photo of the 798th Engineer Forestry Company, again, somewhere in the Southwest Pacific, not sure where, but the photo was taken in 1944, and you see the soldiers transporting logs to a mill. And then this is one of my favorite photos. There's a little boy, this was taken in Burma in 1944, and a soldier, and they're dragging logs to the mill using an elephant. You gotta love it. Okay. And in this one, you see the second way we did a lot of times, the U.S. Army would move the wood from the mill to the, either to an Army depot or to where it was being used at. This is a mill in Cape Gloucester, New Britain, and again, you see a mix of soldiers and local nationals loading wood onto the truck to be transported to where it was needed. If we fast forward up to the Korean War, Korean War is really interesting. It's a war that's basically fought with U.S. surplus equipment, World War II surplus, right? You don't see much new equipment flowing into Korea until the latter half of 1952, so 2/3 of the way, more than 2/3 of the way through the war. So, and Southern Korea has really been basically denuded of trees. So there wasn't much incentive for the U.S. Army to deploy active duty forestry engineers into the theater. But we do know that they again deployed these sawmills, because these photos are of the 11th Combat Engineer Battalion operating a portable World War II era portable mill. So we do know for a fact that there were soldier-operated mills there, but there were no forestry companies deployed. Another kind of interesting idea, the Army experimented with an airborne sawmill. They basically took a commercial little giant tractor saw and painted it green, and experimented with throwing it out of the back of the airplane with a parachute. The experiments, apparently from the reports, were pretty successful. However, for some reason, the Army never decided to operationalize or implement this particular concept. But it did make a great photo. Okay, so let's fast forward to the Vietnam War. And you look at that quote, and if you remember, it has nothing to do with the Vietnam War. This is what Donald Rumsfeld said in 2003 in response to a question that a reporter asked him. But I thought it was very applicable to Vietnam because the situations were really the same. At the time, we had an Army force structure that really wasn't optimal for the conflict that we were getting ready to get into, okay? So let's before we get into how the Army changed its force structure in Vietnam, let's get into why the Army had to change its force structure. So the primary mission of the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War was to deter communism, right? Primarily in Eastern Europe and South Korea but also globally, right, in a worldwide sense. So that was our mission. So the Army set up to fight that particular mission. And what that manifested it in was the active Army force was made up almost exclusively of combat forces, the stuff that we're going to need early in the conflict, right? So a lot of our specialty skills and support skills and follow-on combat forces were located in the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve, okay? But as you may recall, President Johnson refused to mobilize the Guard and Reserve. Think about the conflict in Vietnam. You have a country with very, very poor infrastructure with the exception of 3 cities, right? So you're gonna need a lot of infrastructure built over there. But from an engineering point of view, your entire active force is made up almost exclusively of combat engineers. So the Army's gonna create some special units, small units, to bridge the gap for those capabilities that we're not able to deploy out of the Army Reserve and Army National Guard. So no forestry units are going to deploy to Vietnam. They actually studied doing it and decided not to for multiple reasons. Also, if we back up to 1947, in 1947, the Army changes the size of the forestry units from basically of a company of about 120 men down to a detachment. Those detachments from 1947 until we do away with forestry engineers are going to remain relatively the same size. They're going to be plus or minus 1 or 2. It's generally 1 officer, 38 enlisted guys. Okay. So in the early stages of the Vietnam War, let's take the 80th Forestry Engineers. They were an Army Reserve unit, or excuse me, they were an active Army unit, the 80th Forestry Detachment. Because the Army realizes it doesn't need, it's not going to use forestry engineers in Vietnam. We have all these capacities that we don't have that we need in Vietnam. So we take these units that we're not going to use in Vietnam and repurpose them into something else. So the 80th Forestry Engineers in November of 1966 becomes a firefighting detachment. And then they deploy in February of 67, 3 months. Okay, turn in all their equipment, retrain, draw all their new equipment, and then deploy to Vietnam as firefighting detachments. That doesn't give us enough capacity because there's so much capacity in the Guard and Reserve and that we're not able to reach into because President Johnson has said he's not going to mobilize them. So we end up having to take another thing. And the way we do that is really kind of twofold. Number one, we use a lot of contractors. Vietnam is really the start of the contractor on the battlefield. You go back to World War II, very, very few contractors on the battlefield. We did have DA civilians that deployed, right? And we had special uniforms. They deployed in the special uniforms just like they do today, but very few contractors. Lots of contractors in Vietnam. The second thing was basically the whole of government approach really starts. And you heard a lot about that in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it really starts during the Vietnam War. So we don't have the active duty forestry going, but what we do have is the USAID deploys teams over there to assist the Vietnamese in becoming more efficient in their production and management of forest products. Okay. Following the Vietnam War, we continue this restructuring, and a lot of stuff's going on. We're switching from the draft army to the all-volunteer army. We have the integration of the Women's Army Corps into the Army, which is a phenomenal thing. So if you look in 1970, Women's Army Corps makes up 0.5% of the Army, half of 1% of the Army, right? In the post-Vietnam era, it was kind of hard to recruit. We had real bad recruiting problems. 1970, half of 1%. 1980, a decade later, 8.5% of the Army is made up of women. Huge, huge expansion. And it really helps with the recruiting problems that we were having at the time. The other part of this restructuring is the Army takes certain capabilities and moves them entirely into the reserve forces. Forestry, well drilling, you could almost say that with firefighting. 95% of the Army firefighters are in the Army Reserve, right? But it takes several capabilities and moves them into the Army Reserve, which what it really does is it limits the Army's ability to fight sustained operations without the Guard and the Reserve, okay? And that's how we still exist today. There's certain capabilities that only exist in the Guard and Reserve. So as part of this restructuring, The Army activates the 748th in Missoula, Montana, Forestry Detachment. All right, and these are both done in 1968. And then right here in Hurley, Wisconsin, the 457th Engineer Forestry Detachments. Okay. In 1979, the 748th is going to deactivate, and then they come back a couple years later. But when they come back, they're an asphalt unit, they're a paving unit. So really from 1979, for the next 20 years after that, the 457th in Hurley, Wisconsin is going to be the only forestry outfit in any of the branches of the U.S. Army, any of the components of the U.S. Army. I found this quote in one of the newspapers that I don't remember if it was, I think Jim sent it to me, and I just love it. It was a quote from the first sergeant of the 457th, and he's talking about, hey, when we come on active duty this year, we're going to produce $50,000 worth of lumber products, you know, for the Army that is going to be able to be reused. And it's really kind of, you know, if you're a governor in a state, you really like having certain types of units from the Army Reserve and Army National Guard in your unit. You know, you like medics and you like engineers and you like military policemen because they're really beneficial, you know, for things like disaster relief and that kind of stuff. All right, so Desert Storm. The 457th did not deploy to Desert Storm. Believe it or not, there's not a lot of trees in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, okay? And I can tell you that from personal experience. But for the Desert Storm, really kind of changes the Army. And it starts in the post-Vietnam era with how we changed our force structure and how we changed our fighting. And it's really a validation of what we call air-land battle, okay? And air-land battle, if you think about that time, and many of us in the room were alive at that particular time, my daughter always likes to point out when I make fun of millennials, she tells me that, Dad, you were the generation that climbed underneath your school desk to protect yourself from a nuclear weapon, so don't tell me about millennials. You know, but we remember that time, right, when that made sense to many of us in the room to crawl under your desk, because the Soviet Army was huge. They were almost 5 times the size of the U.S. Army. So we created what were known as the Big Five, and we used technology and force structure to improve and to figure out, that was our plan to defeat communism, right? But as it came out, we didn't have to do it. We were able to deter it, and communism died because of economic reasons, right? Or political. Don't want to get into that too much. But one of the things that comes out of logistics, out of Desert Storm, is this thing called just-in-time logistics, right? Which it works. It made a better bumper sticker than it did an operational concept, but it did work. And what it basically involved was better forecasting by Army units of what the requirements would be, use of commercial supply chains, right? The Army looked at all the things that they were producing or producing to a specific specification that the civilian world was producing equally as well, right? So prior to really about 1980, the Army had a specification for everything, even a glass like this. And after that point, with just-in-time logistics, we stopped producing hundreds of items. When I say producing, we wrote the specification. They were produced by civilian contractors. Instead of stuff being produced specifically for the government, we start buying commercial things where we can. And then we also improved our transportation and logistics and our tracking, right? So I remember back during this time, and one of our generals, he was chewing out this colonel because some supply package, some logistics he needed at a certain place wasn't there, and the colonel was giving him a bunch of excuses, and he told him to basically shut up. And he went over to the computer and he says, look, and he did a couple keystrokes, and he said, here's a teddy bear I bought for my granddaughter. FedEx can tell me where that teddy bear is. Where are my bullets? And it's really interesting because that's where we're at today. Logistically, we can do the same thing FedEx can do in the Army. So that was really kind of just-in-time logistics, right? But this really kind of puts the nail in the coffin of Army forestry operations. This and advances in global logistics. So you take, for example, a World War II Liberty ship, maximum speed, 12.5 miles per hour. In the 1980s and 90s, we started fielding what we call ro-ro ships. They're USNS ships. They're basically merchant marine operated ships. And half the ship is full of combat vehicles, and the other half is filled with containers. Those things can do 25 miles per hour. So advances in the speed of that, advances in how we track logistics, and also the shipping container, think about how things were loaded before and the advancements of the shipping container, the reduction in labor that it takes to ship stuff just because of that shipping container, especially when you're shipping into a combat zone, right? Those things all kind of start really bringing it to an end. So we have the next slide is end of an era. The 457th did continue to drill here in Hurley, Wisconsin, and they were an incredibly popular unit, especially in the press. When you look at, this is a small detachment of 40 people, and they are constantly in the press. Not only the local press. My interest in forestry operations, U.S. Army forestry operations, came in November of 1992 when I read about the 457th in Soldier Magazine, the magazine that goes basically to every soldier in the Army. So in 1999, the 457th gets repurposed into a garrison support unit. So they basically changed their mission. And they turned in their sawmill. At that time, I was still in the Army. I left the Army and used my GI Bill to get a couple of degrees, and I got me a job working in the Army Museum system, which was what I always wanted to do since I was a young private back in the 80s. And I was able to track down at Fort Snelling, and this was 2011 or 12 probably, I was able to track down 2 vehicles that belonged to the 457th. And the U.S. Army Engineer Museum at Fort Leonard Wood has about 30 artifacts from the 457th, mostly from the 1990s period. They even have their sawmill, the last mill that the Army ever used. We were able to move that from from Fort Snelling down to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. We also have about half a dozen artifacts from the 800th, the forestry company in World War II. So at this point, I'll open it up for questions and comments and discussions. And another one of my favorite photos, this is actually from the Alaska-Canadian Highway. And it's hard to see in that photo, but that sawmill is being ran off of a D6 dozer. So, at that point, any questions? Yes, sir.
Start off, when we were in World War I, obviously we were in France doing all the sawing.
Uh-huh.
And so we must have got the wood, the tree from France. How did they deal with that? We had foresters pick up the trees, or they sold us the trees?
Okay, so his question is basically how was forest management done during World War I from a military point of view? So, so keep in mind, we're kind of late to the game in World War I, right? So you've already got the British and the French over there. The French, like most European nations, have a highly regulated forest service. So they had designated specific tracts of land to be used for the consumption of the war. And they even had, contingency operations, as this is, and they were, I don't know if they were saving the best for later or they were trying to use the best for war, but the French government had a plan. Well, obviously, the French Army and the British Army were going to take the best available stuff. So we kind of end up getting what's left of it, but the tracts of land they would cut would be assigned by the French government. And that was one of William Greeley's tasks. He was not only the deputy to Colonel Woodruff, he was also the liaison to the French government, to the French Forest Service, or whatever they call that service. Yes, ma'am.
I have read somewhere, I'm sorry, I can't remember, that the reason why I'm connecting this 10 million board feet a month that we used in spruce, when our troops got over to France, their rail system in France was so bad that we had to, they needed railroad ties, they needed spruce for the railroad cars just to get the men to where they were needed.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was basically the use of lumber and the shortage of railroads and the poor quality of the French railway system. Absolutely true. So remember back to that slide where I said in 1915, 16, 17, or really 15, 16, the Army's kind of looking at the war over there, right? And remember, we have these liaison officers over in France already that are watching, because we always deployed us and we always had observers that went into the conflict, right? So we really knew what's going on. The Allied nations had sent military officers to Washington to work with us. Some of that was, they were coordinating support, like even their aircraft, a lot of their aircraft were built in the States, right, and shipped over. So, but The French railway system, yes, it was very, very poor. Okay, so we end up deploying, you remember that one slide where I said the first step the Army took to expanding the Corps of Engineers was adding 9 railway regiments and 1 forestry regiment. If we look at the first 10 regiments of engineers that deployed to France, one of them is a combat engineer unit, regiment. All the rest of them are railway, okay? And the 35th Engineer Regiment, for example, we actually shipped railway cars over. And this is a great example of how the Army learns from its lessons. What we did is we shipped, built the railway cars in the States, we disassembled them, we put them in, even locomotives, put them in the hulls of ships, right? Put straw around them, shipped them over to France, and then we took them out, and in Niger's, France, the 35th engineers, their job was to put it back together. Very quickly, they're writing back to the chief of engineers saying, hey, we need some machinists because you guys lost a lot of parts on the way. But these guys put together all these things.
I read too with that, the gauges didn't match.
Exactly, yeah.
So the United States basically built the entire railroad system.
That we use, right?
France.
We did use French light rail. So there's basically 2 types of railway units in World War I. We have standard US rail, and then we have light rail, which was basically the French system. It's pre-made metal rail. But it was really only used in depots and on the front lines. Interestingly enough, in World War II, when we decide we're going to start shipping trains around the world, we read back and say, hey, disassembly was not an option. So what we did is we turned to the banana industry. Yes, so the bananas would be picked in Central America, put on trains, and then they had special ships called sea trains that would pull up and they would load the entire train onto these, basically these car ferries that ferried trains, and they would take them up into like Mobile and Galveston, and then they'd come ashore and do that. So what we did is we took some of those sea trains and made them into U.S. Navy ships or Army Transport Service ships, and we used them to transport stuff, the rail cars.
I have one more. What I didn't hear in your presentation was the surveying that the Army Corps of Engineers did even in forestry.
Mm-hmm.
They would decide, excuse me, they would decide, for example, where the parameters were for the Northern Island. I'm pretty sure it came out of Army Corps of Engineers.
So us with USDA, so it's funny how all of our Forest Service units are full of Forest Service guys. A lot of our survey units, both in World War I and later, are full of USDA guys. And matter of fact, during World War II, so there's a guy named Bigsby, who's a USDA guy, comes on active duty, becomes an Army Engineer Officer in World War I, and he's really trying to get to the point where his goal is to be able to take aerial photographs and create a topographic map that is accurate enough that you could use it to adjust artillery fire, okay? But when he returns, and he's not able to do that in World War I. He's trying, but he's not able to do that in World War I. But when he gets off of active duty, he goes back to the USDA, he's learned all this stuff about aerial photography, and they use it for crop surveys. And then, so the Army Corps of Engineers continues to work with USDA, and then by the time we get into World War II, we're able to do what Bigsby had tried to do all along. So.
We can try one time for one more.
Can you speculate why the Army selected Hurley, Wisconsin?
I knew you were going to ask me. The question was, can you speculate why the Army chose Hurley, Wisconsin? I know John's got some ideas, and I think they're hypotheses. I was not able to find anything. This is probably a landmine here. It should come as no service to you that there are a little bit of politics involved in where things end up, different types of units. You know, from a point of view, if we need a forestry unit, it generally doesn't matter where it's at, right? We're not going to put it in Arizona, obviously, right? But it doesn't matter where it goes in the state. So there are a lot of, political things and, about where stuff gets located. I wish I knew the answer to that question. And same thing in Missoula. I think there's a forestry school in Missoula. So that may make some sense to why.
There's a Forest Service Technology Center.
Is that what it is? Yeah. Unfortunately, the Army doesn't have a history of writing down why we do what we do, which makes my job as a historian really difficult. But I appreciate the questions I'm unable to answer, and I tell you, there's a lot of them. All right.
All right, well, thank you, Troy.